Well, hello everyone. This is John Dupuy and Javi Otero, and at Spirit Tech 2.0, and we have with us Bill Harris, who many of you have probably heard of for years, and I certainly have. And basically, what got me on this path and this technology was an interview I heard with you and Ken Wilber. Must have been about 11 years ago or so, Bill. And it got me thinking, like, wow, maybe this is the answer to my inability to meditate very well, and much less the students I'm trying to teach to meditate. And sure enough, when I paid and got my first level of Holosync, it literally changed my life. I had a very powerful spiritual opening in the first week. I was going, this is ridiculous. I'm enlightened in like 6 days. And it was an opening. I wouldn't say I'm enlightened, but it did open a spaciousness that I began to release the trauma that had been keeping me sick for many years, and with my depression. And I was just going through my bookshelf today, and I have your Thresholds of the Mind, which was very, very useful in that initial healing process. And I was just going over it this morning. So, and I'm going, God, I got to reread this. This is great stuff. It still applies. And I hear you've just written another book. Is that true?
I have. It's called The New Science of Super Awareness. It's about all the new brain research and how it can be applied to both solving a lot of human problems that previously were not thought to be soluble or solvable, or if they were solvable, it was with a lot of work and a lot of hard going. But now that we know which parts of the brain are involved, and we know quite a bit about how to change those parts of the brain, it's a much more targeted approach. And then on the other side are all kinds of human capabilities, which I have sort of bundled together and by just under the umbrella of awareness, which I don't mean something airy-fairy by that. I mean something very, very specific, but that a lot of human capabilities like creativity, the ability to enter flow states, the ability to be focused, the ability, having a choice over what your mind does to a great degree. There are all kinds of human abilities that can be greatly enhanced by knowing which parts of the brain are involved and by creating changes in those parts of the brain. And the age-old approach for doing this has always been meditation. And when you meet someone who has meditated for 30 years or something like that, if you're discerning enough at least, you immediately notice that those people there's something about them that is different. They're comfortable in their own skin in a way that most people aren't. They are able to maintain an equanimity despite whatever else happens, and that they are very discerning, are very aware of what's going on around them in a way that most people aren't. And they're also very aware of what's going on inside of them in a way that other people aren't. And I have to say that, I'm just sort of talking about some of the things that, the reasons why I wrote this book, but I see spiritual growth in a lot different way than I used to. Most people are very focused on attaining transcendent states, and I went through a big period where I was spending a lot of time doing this, and luckily, for the latter part of that period, I was spending a lot of time with Genpo Roshi, a very well-known Zen master, and he was really able to frame that for me in a very interesting way. I'm not so concerned with transcendent states anymore. They're certainly a beautiful experience, but I don't even think that's what Zen is about, actually. Although that's what it seems to be about, and that's kind of the come-on to people. But there are things that happen beyond the time in your spiritual development where you have found out, the way I look at it, and this is not from Zen, but the way I look at it is transcendent states are finding out what happens when you stop filtering your experience through your mind. when the mind is relatively in neutral or in some cases shut off, you experience something that is quite different because you're not processing it through your mind, which tends to divide everything into this and that, here and there, up and down, me, not me, separate things, separate events. These are all ideas about reality, but not really reality. And I would say at least two parts of being human. One is mastering how your mind creates your reality, which takes a lot of awareness to do that. And then also a different kind of awareness to see what's beyond the mind, what things look like when the mind is not acting as the supreme filter of everything. A lot of people have called this non-duality or no mind. There's all kinds of doing without a doer and all kinds of terms like that. It turns out, as far as my perspective at this point, that getting into that state, which in Zen is called a Kensho experience, or even having what they call a Maha Kensho, which is like where you are permanently in, or at least aware, or part of your experience is balanced in that state. That's not the end of the journey. But since most people don't even ever get to that point, I don't very often talk about what comes after that because most people are so drawn to the transcendent experience and quite frankly, what happens after that doesn't start out so well.
So in a certain sense, when the minds and the filters and the stories can be released in that moment, there's a certain transcendence, but it's a very present right now transcendent, just the suchness of this present moment. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it also, the things that keep you from a transcendent state. I mean, we're doing this in sort of a weird order that usually I'm laying a big groundwork when I talk about certain things, and we're just sort of diving in the deep end. But the things that the human mind does that keeps you from being in a transcendent state are necessary for survival. If you were in a transcendent state all the time, which I don't think is actually possible, quite frankly, if you were in a transcendent state all the time, you would need people to take care of you. Because if you're in a non-dual state and, I think it's the sixth patriarch of Zen has this very famous thing that starts off essentially saying that, if you can stop choosing between this and that, then you're really set. But it's choosing between this and that causes you to eat instead of just forgetting about eating and starving to death. Come in out of the cold. Take care of yourself. You have to. You can't be in a state where you're not a non-dual state and still take care of yourself. Which is why, if you see these famous gurus in India, they almost always have these followers around them who are feeding them and taking care of them. And you don't see the Dalai Lama and people like that. You don't see them, being in the same zoned out sort of state that a lot of these Hindu gurus are in. They're very much in the world because I think they have quite frankly, in my opinion, they have a greater understanding of the stages beyond the transcendent. The Tibetan Buddhists understand this very well, and so do the Zen people.
So you can have the transcendent state, which in some cases is like, the Christian being born again. Everything is different. It's really shifted. But as states do, they happen to fade, okay? And I was haunted by states for years. I'd had these great spiritual experiences, and it would go away, and I was still my same old jerk ego self, and having had a taste of the higher, it was very painful. So I'm assuming through practice, and especially with technology and spirituality is what we're talking about here, that we can kind of have our cake and eat it too. In other words, we can have the awakening experience, and sometimes it's very dramatic, and other times it's subtle and it just grows. but we can have our feet in the world too. So we can kind of have both. And I would say that probably the way to achieve that is through dedicated ongoing practice. And of course, using the technology, the meditation technology that you've been developing for a long time, it enhances that and makes it more available to more of us than before.
Well, that's certainly true. Holosync dramatically accelerates this whole process, and we guesstimate that it accelerates it by about 8 times, so that a year of Holosync is approximately like 8 years of mindfulness meditation in terms of the results you get. So that means that somebody can meditate for 4 or 5 years diligently, daily with Holosync, and have the same kind of presence as someone who has maybe meditated an hour a day for 30 years. And one of the reasons that we know this is that we have lots of people using Holosync around the world. There's been like 2.2 million people use Holosync in 193 countries, and we get a lot of feedback from them. And many of these people, you see, I mean, probably the people listening to this, and certainly the two of you, and we're really into this sort of thing. We're well read in Eastern philosophy and Western interpretations of Eastern philosophy, and the Ken Wilber and all these other things. And most people, though, that are doing this, in fact, most people that are interested in Eastern philosophy in the West, they are not that well read on it. They haven't gone that deeply into it. They haven't gone deeply into the practice of it, really. We have all these people that are using Holosync, but are not experts in Eastern meditation. They have not read all the books. They don't know all the jargon. They don't know all the kind of internal signposts that people experience when they do a long-term meditation practice. And yet, these people, after they've used Holosync for 3, 4, 5, 6 years or something like that, when they talk about their life and they talk about the way they navigate their way through life and so on and so forth, they say in their own words the same things that you hear from the Buddha said, or Zen masters say, or long time Tibetan Buddhist monks say. They're not saying it the same words because it's coming from a different culture and everything, but as they describe how they deal with life and different situations in life, they're saying essentially the same things that you hear from really, really experienced people who have devoted their life to this kind of spiritual practice. And in other words, another way to look at this is when you meet somebody else that has done extensive practice for a long time, you can tell when you're talking to them or when you're relating to them, you can tell that they have, as opposed to someone who is very well educated about all this but hasn't done the practice.
Sure.
The educated person can talk the talk and use the terminology and describe things and all that, but you can tell that they haven't done it. They don't have the same presence. They don't have the same. There's something about the person who's really done this that you can experience by being around them. But I have, I interviewed someone. You remember when I interviewed you, John, years ago, because I was interviewing people that were in the last few levels of the Holosync program. There was another woman that I interviewed who was, like I said, not a big Eastern philosophy reader or expert, and she was saying, as I've gotten toward the end of this, I find that people kind of are drawn to me a lot, and they come to me and they ask my advice about things. They ask me, in other words, she's having people come to her almost like she's a guru and asking her questions, being very vulnerable with her and saying, well, this is happening in my life, and what do you think? And she says, I don't know why these people come to me and want my advice. And And she's very humble about it, and she kind of says, I try to help them as much as I can. I hear this a lot from the longtime Holosync users, is that people gravitate to them and see something in them. They become very persuasive. They become, in a way, charismatic. I don't mean in a dramatic sense, but there's something about them. These are some of the I got off on that tangent just because I had said that people get results about 8 times faster than with traditional meditation.
And as you know, I've worked with this technology with addicts. And years ago, when we first started this, I was having them do an hour of Holosync in the morning, an hour Holosync in the evening. So these fresh off the streets, hardcore addicts. And within a couple of weeks, before I even talked about mindfulness or any of this stuff, I noticed they were becoming mindful. In a couple of weeks of sitting together, and I think there's power in sitting together with other people, but everybody using this technology, and they would just begin to be able to step away from their dramas and go, ooh, no wonder I was so miserable. Right. No wonder I'm so full of rage and resentments, etc.
The book, The New Science of Super Awareness that I wrote, is not really directed at advanced seekers, although there's certainly information in it that any advanced seeker would go, wow, I'm glad I know that now, because I'm talking about the brain, but I'm kind of starting from the ground up, and I'm describing. So, what you just said about people becoming mindful, there's a lot that's known now about what's going on in the brain when that happens. And being mindful is quite different than having a transcendent experience, too. And so I talk about a lot of things in this book. I talk about flow states, and I talk about heart rate variability, which is strongly affected by meditation and by Holosync. And I'm talking about a lot of what I would call super aware states that begin to happen through meditation if you take a long time, or Holosync much more quickly. But the main thing I'm saying really is that there's a war going on in your brain. Most people are living out of their limbic system. The limbic system is the source of the fight or flight response. And, the amygdala is one part of that, but I just sort of talk about it as a package of the limbic system. The limbic system the limbic system does some things that are very necessary too, but I'm going to talk about the things it does that are kind of destructive. One of them is that it throws people into fight or flight, which is great if you have a life-threatening experience. But the problem in modern life is that people are so chronically in a stressful situation and in fight or flight that it becomes the baseline. And they don't even realize that they're at least in low-grade fight or flight all the time. Now, if somebody has been really traumatized, as you were, John, and as I certainly was, then they're in probably even more fight or flight, and they develop all kinds of crazy coping mechanisms that cause them further trouble and all that sort of thing. But, people go into fight or flight because they can't find their cell phone. Not life-threatening. Certainly a pain in the ass, but not life-threatening. Or somebody cuts you off in work, or whatever. Everybody could make their own list. And there's a lot of health problems that come with that, because your brain, your brain tells your adrenal glands to make cortisol, and it's great when you need some, and it's supposed to shut off when the whatever's going on is over, but it doesn't shut off for most people. So they're harming their health. Many quote unquote diseases of aging are really just diseases of chronic stress for a long time. And people would be living a lot longer without being ill, without this sort of thing. And so there's this whole problem of fight or flight. Also, when you're in fight or flight, all the blood drains blood drains from your brain into your extremities so you can fight or flee. So you lose IQ points. You're not very smart. You don't make good decisions. You get yourself into all kinds of problems. This is one of the problems with people that have been emotionally traumatized. is that they're in such fight or flight all the time, and the part of their brain that could make better decisions is offline to a great degree. And so, those of us, I made just a whole string of daily horrible decisions, drove people away from me, created all kinds of huge problems in my life because I was in chronic fight or flight, and I saw other people as being dangerous and a threat. The other problem with the limbic system is that it causes you to desire things so strongly, and at the same time that you're desiring them really strongly, that you don't have any foresight of the consequences of them.
Yeah, this is a part of the brain that's so implicated in addiction. I mean,
Exactly.
It's right there. Yeah.
Dopamine is the secret weapon of the limbic system. Dopamine, again, has some very positive roles that it plays in many things in the brain. But I'm just talking about the fact that here's a good example of how powerful dopamine is. There was one study they did with they accidentally found out which part of the brain to stimulate to have it create a squirt of dopamine for some rats. And so they taught the rats to pull a lever to get another hit of dopamine. And first of all, they found the rats would pull that lever continuously 24 hours a day. They would not sleep. They would not eat. They would not have sex. They would do nothing but keep pulling that lever. And ironically, dopamine does not create pleasure. It creates huge focus, arousal, and wanting. But it doesn't create the reward. That's created in another part of the brain. So it just keeps you wanting. It's like when you fall in love and you're making all kinds of dopamine, the object of which is the person you love, and you will do anything to please them, to be with them. But if you think about it, there's this underlying anxiety. At the same time, there's this great desire. There is this sort of anxiety involved. And when the dopamine wears off, i.e. when the honeymoon is over, which may take a year or two, then you start noticing all the things about your partner that you can't stand that you thought were really charming when you were under the spell of dopamine. And so, I mean, that's just another example of how people don't notice the consequences because they're under the sway of dopamine. But anyway, these rats, the next thing they did was they made it so that they had to run from one side of the cage to the other. There were two levers, and they could only pull, after they pulled one of them, they had to go to the other side to pull the other. The same lever wouldn't work until the other one had been pulled. Then they put an electric grid between the inside the middle of the cage. So they had to run over that, and they ran over that thing over and over to get the dopamine till they burned their little feet off.
Wow.
And so I often say, how often do human beings burn their bank accounts, their arteries, their lungs, their general health, their relationships, etc.
Yeah.
So when people eat things that they shouldn't eat, when they eat too much of it, when they say things they shouldn't say and get themselves into trouble, when they spend money on things that they don't need with money they don't have, and all the other ways, or when you blow off exercising or blow off meditating, people make these, when I get home at night, I'm going to meditate or I'm going to exercise for 20 minutes every day. And then you get home and you see, dopamine just causes you to want something now in the moment. And so if what you want now is to relax and watch TV or go on Facebook or something instead of exercising, then that's what you'll do. You cannot think about the future. This guy, Walter Mischel at Stanford, did this really interesting experiment called the marshmallow test. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but he took these preschoolers and put them in a bare room with just a table and a plate on the table and sat them in a chair, and then he put a treat on the plate. And one of them was a marshmallow, which is why it became known as the marshmallow test. And they said, you can have that marshmallow right now if you want to and eat it. Or if you wait, I'm going to leave the room for a little while. It was about 20 minutes, which is a long time if you're 3, 4, or 5 years old. if you wait till I get back, you can have 2 marshmallows. And actually a very small number of them actually figured out strategies for waiting, distracting themselves and so on and so forth. So there was a bunch of interesting stuff that they learned from that. But what was really interesting, they started following them throughout life and well into middle age. And the people that had been able to delay gratification, they had higher grades, over 200 points higher in their SATs. They had better jobs, made more money, had better relationships, set goals and achieved them, had better health, were less easily rattled, and there was a list of, that's about 30% of the list of the things that they found that was different between these. And then they scanned their brains. The people that could wait had very strong prefrontal cortexes and calm limbic systems. The ones that couldn't wait had really strong limbic systems, so they were really ruled by fight or flight and dopamine, and they had very weak prefrontal cortexes. And so the prefrontal cortex is kind of the savior. Ironically, it's what has to turn off for you to have a transcendent experience, but it's what has to turn on for you to be mindful. So it's kind of ironic in a way. So the prefrontal cortex is sort of the executive controller. It's behind long-term planning, learning from mistakes, creativity, pattern recognition, and all kinds of other things that are kind of,
Values.
Yeah, values, regulating your behavior, all that sort of thing. And if it's strong enough, it supervises the limbic system. So when you walk by the bakery case in Whole Foods and you see the yummy sugar-laden stuff, you say, oh, wow, that looks really good. I think I should get those. But then your prefrontal cortex, which doesn't work as fast, it then says, no, bad idea. That's going to feel good for about a half a minute while you eat it, and then you're going to feel guilty. The sugar is bad for you, and you walk by if you have a strong enough prefrontal cortex. So in a lot of ways, mindfulness, being mindful, is about having a strong prefrontal cortex and a calm limbic system, so that the prefrontal cortex it's not that the limbic system doesn't create desire, it's that the prefrontal cortex is able to take that dopamine and attach it to more long-term goals.
In addiction treatment, that's exactly what I teach my students. What we're trying to do is relocate the locus of control over your life from the desiring, craving limbic system to the prefrontal cortex, the more human, more evolved part. And when somebody's in addiction, I know you've gone through your struggles out when you were young. You're just in this state of constantly being a slave. And I was going to ask you, what do you think, or maybe you have data on this, but what do you think they're going to find when holosyncers or brain entrainment meditators have been doing it for many years die and they look at their brains? Do you think they're going to actually see a physical shift or a difference?
Well, absolutely, because they have looked at the brain. You don't have to die anymore to have someone look at your brain, because they have fMRI and SPECT scans and other things so that they can look at your brain already. Daniel Amen, who is a very good friend of mine, has done. Every time I say a number, the next time I see him, he says, "Nope, it's he has a higher number." But last time I was with him, which wasn't very long ago, he said, I think 125,000 brain scans, which he uses to diagnose, ADD, post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, addictions, and on and on and on and on, all kinds of things. And then he has various ways of treating them. And he's a big proponent of Holosync too. He's sent us lots and lots and lots of people. But what they're going to find is that the people that are using Holosync do have an enhanced prefrontal cortex, and they do have a calm limbic system. And the reason I say this is because these people all exhibit the behavior of people that have that. Same thing with people that are that's one of the things that causes people who are long-term meditators to be calm and collected and mindful and all those sorts of things, is because they are, it's less romantic than the Eastern philosophy descriptions of these things, but I think it's awe-inspiring that the brain is creating all of this, and that not only that, but the brain is plastic, can be changed, and we're starting to find out very precise ways that you can change the brain in order to create these effects. There's one more thing I should probably mention that I think is really interesting, which is flow states. Stephen Kotler wrote a great book called The Rise of Superman, which everyone should get. They should also get this book, my book, The New Science of Super Awareness. And you can go to centerpoint.com, and right at the top of the homepage, there's a icon you can click on. You get a free PDF of it. Or if you want the hard copy, which I like because I like to highlight things and stuff. But if you want the hard copy, you can pay the shipping and handling, and we'll send you that for free too. But we want you to pay to get it to you. But I got to know Stephen. I'm making a documentary about all this stuff now, and I filmed him for that, and we spent a lot of time together. He and a group he's associated with, one of the things they found out that when people go into a flow state, where time seems to stand still, you're doing whatever you're doing just because you love doing it, not because of some goal necessarily, and one moment flows into the next, and you do exactly what needs to be done to handle something that's very challenging. That in a flow state, it's very interesting that most of your prefrontal cortex shuts off. They call it transient hypofrontality. Transient because it cannot be sustained beyond a certain length of time. I mean, your brain runs out of the neurochemicals involved in doing this, and you need to renew them. And it's called hypo, which is the opposite of hyper. It's your different parts of your prefrontal cortex go offline. And what that means is that the remaining few parts of it that are active get all the bandwidth. So that if you're playing jazz, which I do, you have to go into a flow state to play jazz well, because it's happening way too fast. Now, actually, a lot of this is handled by your stuff in your brainstem, not in your prefrontal cortex. But when your prefrontal cortex goes offline, mostly, the few parts that are left are sort of guiding the process. But it's almost like a kind of mindfulness where there's a part of you, like if I'm playing jazz, there's a part of me that's watching, and there's a tiny little bit of sort of commentary going on about it, but not very much. All the second guessing, am I doing this right? What should I do next? All the doubts, all that stuff totally go offline. And interestingly enough, a transcendent experience is something very similar, because the parts of your brain that locate you in time and space go off. One of the reasons that people have a different view of time in a flow state is because the part of the brain that allows you to keep track of time goes offline. I've also found, by the way, that this same thing happens when you're using ayahuasca. The same thing happens, that time just stands still. So parts of the brain that are responsible for locating yourself in space, and also for kind of distinguishing the difference between where you leave off and not you begins. And I mean that in a very spatial sense. You stop the part of you that sort of divides things into me and not me, or up and down and here and there, and all that goes offline. And so, the biggest thing the brain does that keeps you in that dualistic state is it divides everything up into this and that. And then it does another thing. It says, these this pile of thises are all good and I want to have those, and these are all bad and I want to not have those. Alan Watts called this the game of black and white, where the main rule of life is that white must win. And so this is the double bind of being a human, is that you have to play. It's like I said at the beginning, if you don't divide things into this, that, you can't survive. Whether you ate or didn't eat, whether you were alive or dead, or whether you were warm or cold or whatever, you wouldn't do anything about it. It's playing the game of black and white that allows you to survive. So you have to do it. I mean, unless you really don't, in a grand sense, it doesn't matter whether you live or die. But, that's sort of the game we're playing, is that I do care whether I live or die. So somehow this is sort of where the idea of Mahayana in Buddhism comes in one sense, in that it's a middle path. You have to somehow be in the world and also be aware that everything is connected. There are no separate things. There are no separate events. Those are mental constructs about reality. But if you don't play as if that's true, you can really mess yourself up and not survive. So you have to sort of, it's sort of like being in the world but not of it.
So let me ask you one thing. I've totally noticed what you're talking about, the flow states. I'm also a musician. Since in the last 5 years, I started exploring electric blues, and I've moved into jazz, and I get into these states where I'm being played and I know what the other person's going to do before they do it, and it's just amazing. My tennis playing, I've experienced this much more than I ever did before I began practicing with this technology. Also, my writing, it's like there's no such thing as writer's block anymore. I just put it down and, it just begins to come out. What's really going on in the brain? Why is this technology seem to enhance creativity and flow states?
One of the things, there's a whole lot of things that are happening. One is that if you're taking someone through this whole spectrum of brainwave patterns every day, the brain is plastic. It gets so that it's good at creating those brainwave patterns. So, anything you do repeatedly, your brain turns more real estate, more neurons, more neural pathways over to doing it. And so when you go through alpha, theta, delta brainwaves every day, you get better at making them. Now, most people are pretty good at making beta brain waves, not so good at alpha and theta, and people make a lot of delta waves when they're asleep. But making waking delta waves is a very, very rare and advanced thing. But we have people do that with Holosync every day, and there are different joy or creativity or different varieties of mindfulness and focus and concentration and charisma and leadership abilities, persuasiveness. All these things are have different brainwave patterns associated with them. And so when you need to be creative, if you have made a lot of theta waves so that your brain knows how to make them, when it's time where you need it, you're thinking, oh, I have to figure out how to do this, you can make the bursts of theta waves that will allow you to, do this pattern recognition thing that allows you to have an out-of-the-box solution to a problem. And, one of the problems I have with my staff all the time is we have some challenge, and, everybody talks about it a little bit, and suddenly I know what to do. I don't even consciously know how I know what to do, but I know what to do, and I know when I get a certain feeling that I'm right, and that but the other people aren't on board with that yet, and so they think I'm nuts, except that there are some of them that have been with me long enough that they come up to me afterwards and say, well, I don't have any idea what you're talking about, but I don't want to go against what you're saying, because every time I have, you turned out to be right. And I'm saying, I don't even know exactly why this is right, but I'm in a bet that it is.
Yeah, I jokingly call that the Ramtha thing, because it just seems to come from a higher place than my little ego and these things just like...
Yeah, well, it's there's these two systems in the brain. One is called the explicit system. This is about things that need to be explicated. And that's your conscious mind. which can only hold so many units of whatever at one time. And it's fairly slow, it's linear, and it's what people think of as being left brain, for instance. Then there's the implicit mind. That's what is activated when you're in a flow state. That's what's anytime you're doing something that is happening when you're talking. Your implicit system is I'm not sitting there thinking, nor are you guys, what am I going to say? I mean, occasionally you might say, what should I say next or something, but you're not thinking about the syntax of what you're saying and what words to say unless you really don't know what you're talking about, or you're feeling self-conscious, so you're hesitating and all that. Feeling self-conscious blocks a flow state, because one of the things that goes away in a flow state is evaluating what you're doing as you're doing it. You just do it without evaluation. So,
Bill, I wanted to open up. Javi, did you have any comments or questions for Bill at this point?
What is it that you're doing now? What are you excited about now? Where is your leading edge? I'm really interested to know.
I've had some infrastructure problems at Centerpoint, and so we're cleaning those up, and I'm getting ready for a big new push where we're going to get way, way bigger. I'm also creating this documentary that is based on a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about, and I just was asked to join the board of Peter Diamandis' X Prize, the X Prize Innovation Board, which gives me the opportunity to play with some of the biggest visionaries in the world, really. And I'm very into a lot of philanthropic things, of building schools in Africa, and there's a charity that helps kids in the inner city that I've been supporting for a long time, and then the Sex Prize thing is fairly new. So. I'm just trying to make a bigger, when you become a Zen monk, you take this vow. I vow to save all sentient beings. All sentient beings are suffering. I vow to save them all. And it's, of course, impossible. There's no way to save all sentient beings. And in fact, one of the things that Zen is sort of teaching you by osmosis is there is no escape from suffering. There's escape from creating additional suffering, what in Buddhism they often call the second dart. There's all these things that you can't do anything about as a human being. You can't do anything about the physical processes of the universe. They are there. You can't do anything about the fact that human beings are sensitive and need a certain range of, certain kinds of gases and temperature and gravity and so on to survive. You can't do anything about the sun and cosmic rays and those physical things. You also can't do anything about what everybody else does. Other people, darn it, they keep doing things that are at cross purposes with what I'm trying to do. And, you can influence a few people, but there's too many of them so that you can't do anything. And then the biggie is you can't do anything about the fact that everything is impermanent. Everything comes into being, is there for a while, passes away. So if you're a human being, you are going to experience disappointments and losses, and everyone is traumatized by life. And so that you can't do anything about except to kind of accept it. A lot of the suffering people have is because in response to those things, they get into all kinds of resistance, and that creates additional suffering, which the Buddhists call the second dart. The other thing is the first dart, and Buddha was a pretty smart guy, actually, to come up with this stuff. So, at any rate, I'm trying to do what I can to help change people's brains so that they are more mindful, that they see this. That's what happens when your prefrontal cortex gets really strong and your limbic system calms down. You see very clearly the ways that you're causing that second dart. You see the ways you're causing yourself suffering, and actually you see the ways that you're causing other people suffering too, which is sort of a developmental thing for people that know Ken Wilber's work or other developmental methodologies. Someone could be very mindful, but they're at a lower developmental level, so they're thinking about mainly their own suffering, and their mindfulness keeps them from creating more suffering for themselves than is already kind of embedded in the human experience. But then the person at a higher developmental level, they begin to think more and more about the suffering of other people. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to expand my reach so that I can affect more people in this way. And darn it, most of them won't listen. Would you believe that?
One of the things, getting back to the technology, that I've found that I think using this technology, traditional meditation doesn't do, that it seems to really make it a somatic experience. And you're really able to somatically kind of grind out a lot of the trauma and a lot of the stuff that keeps us kind of stuck in our traumas and our stories. Whereas just traditional meditation, sometimes you can see it, but it's more of a kind of a dissociated observation. But there's something very interesting about the binaural, about Holosync and this technology that really brings the body into the process of waking up and growing up.
I think that probably does happen in traditional meditation, but you have to meditate, 6-8 hours a day or something like that. I'll bet that if you're up there in your hut in the Himalayas, those guys, I bet they're having that experience, something like that too. I think what happens is that you become very aware, not just of your thoughts and that sort of stuff, but your emotions, which are really somatic experiences. I think you're right. This does make you very aware of, to use a little bit of an airy-fairy term, of how people hold traumatic stuff in their body. And as awareness creates choice. That's sort of my motto. Awareness creates choice. Once you see that you're doing that, once you see that you're holding that in your body, or you see what you're doing mentally, once you begin to do these things that you were doing outside your awareness, holding stuff in your body would be one, believing certain dysfunctional things, or valuing certain dysfunctional things, or thinking certain, focusing your mind on what you don't want instead of what you do want, things like that create bad outcomes. You see yourself doing those, and you can't keep doing it anymore if you are doing it, quote unquote, with awareness. Awareness takes what was on autopilot and makes it into a choice. That's really what mindfulness is seeing things clearly enough that you begin to do them. See, if you think negatively with awareness, it won't be very long before you can't do it, because it creates consequences that you don't want. And you can see that you have to have a strong prefrontal cortex in order to see that, because you can't see consequences beyond the moment unless your prefrontal cortex is strong enough to see them. That's the part of the brain that sees that stuff. So, the thing about the mindfulness, of course, I've been doing this type of meditation for about 11 years, working on 11 years, and there's a certain spaciousness that is part of mindfulness, that when you start looking at your little conditioned things, they become really small in relation to this big witness or observer. And it's like, if I can observe this from the outside, then what does that say? What does that say about who I really am? What's going on here when I'm much bigger than my little self that I thought that was causing me all this suffering? And it makes it just easier to shift. Well stated. Ken has this thing about, having something versus being it. Being immersed in something. When you're immersed in something, you are it. That's what happened. You're in a certain developmental level. You're immersed in it. It's happening outside your awareness. All the ways of navigating. But when you move to the next developmental level, it's really because you move from being it to having it.
Yep.
That's why he says transcend and include. You transcend the current way of navigating your way through life, but all the stuff that's valuable from that level, you're supposed to include it. A lot of people don't. That's why Ken has all kinds of stuff he talks about the dysfunctional things that arise when people don't include, because they often discount everything from the previous. But that's what you're talking about is when you move from being something, which is it's unconscious and you're doing it outside your mind, to having it. Now you're kind of looking at it from the outside. You know, when you have values, that's different than being your values. You know, and once that creates choice.
This has been awesome. We might have to do part 2 and part 3 and just bust these up. You've given so much. Look, Javi, did you have anything else that you wanted to add or comment?
Maybe quickly, how do you see the field evolving? You know, because you've been in the field for so many years. You started meditating before I was born. So I'm really curious to know, how do you see brainwave entrainment as you've done it, for example, evolving, and how in 10 years, 20 years, you know, or even beyond?
There may evolve more effective ways of entraining the brain. The brain is not, it's not like everybody gets immediately entrained exactly in the same way. People have resistance to entrainment sometimes, and they have to use something like this for a while before they begin to relax into it a little bit, and they can be entrained more easily. Also, there are, it used to be that EEG was the state of the art in measuring this stuff, but now it's really SPECT scans and PET scans and fMRI and things like that. And I have my doubts, but I've always just in the past described Holosync as it works because it changes your brainwaves. It may be that we find out that there's something else going on beyond just changing your brainwaves. That certainly we see entrainment happening, but it isn't the same in every person. And I've been talking to some researchers about doing a study around this, because I want to find out what is happening. There's more going on than just brainwaves being changed if the prefrontal cortex is being strengthened and the limbic system is being calmed. Maybe the brainwaves are just sort of an echo of those other changes. But I mean, this is just pure speculation on my part. So I don't know. I've been getting to know a lot of people who are both researching the brain, and in a lot of cases the brain as it applies to meditation and other related things. And also there's a whole bunch of people who I'm really one of, who are taking what they find and kind of curating it to the public and then figuring out ways to use it. I know people that are using new brain research discoveries to enhance leadership, for instance. And just almost anything is affected by the brain. So anything, whether it's spiritual growth or psychological healing or, creativity, flow states, all kinds of things like that are all based on brain changes. And so as these people find out more things, we will probably have different tools, or they will find new ways to change and target different parts of the brain. In some ways, as effective and as powerful as it is, brain entrainment is somewhat crude, I think. I mean, I say crude in the sense that, when Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, that it worked pretty well. It was pretty amazing, but it was crude compared to what we have today. And so in years to come, I think we'll look back on this and think it's crude. It's one of the most powerful things we have right now, but I'm sure it'll get refined.
Isn't that exciting? Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the old type of phone, and then you're talking about a smartphone, or the latest addition to that, where it connects you to the whole world. I mean, just technology's going nuts in our time. I was going to ask you, there's going to be a one of your tracks that's going to be a demo track for the people listening to. They go and they can listen to it and experience it. Is there anything you'd like to say about what that track is, or anything that might just help people understand it at a deeper level?
But it essentially takes you, it takes you through the spectrum of brainwave patterns over, I think it's about 18 minutes long, but
Nice.
I've worked here. I don't remember all these things anymore. But it's a pretty nice taste, a pretty nice experience. I think it's better to do it every day for 5, 6, 7 days, because you really can see, even in that short of time, you can see that the effects kind of accumulate, and you start to see how it affects the rest of your day. And even in a short while, you do begin to become more mindful, and you begin to, I mean, you've noticed this with the addicts.
Sure.
That you would have them listening to something even when you picked them up at the airport or something.
That's right.
Within a very short time, they have a different perspective already, and even though it's very early in the process,
they start feeling hope. Like, wow, something's actually working, things are shifting, and they can start seeing their way out of it. And it's hard.
I can't tell you how many people have listened to Holosync once and said, wow, this is the first time I have really felt good since I was about 8 years old.
Yeah.
Something like that. They have been in that fight or flight stress response almost continuously, and this takes them out of it, and they go, wow, I'd forgotten that I could feel this way.
Thank you so much. It's great talking to you again. It's been a while. And, super gratitude for what you've done in your life and for your teaching and for your technology. Made a huge difference in my life. And you're right up there at the top of the list of acknowledgments in my book, Integral Recovery, and gratitude for what you provided us. And you look great, and you look vital and vibrant, and it's just good to see you doing well.
Well, thank you, John.
I really, really appreciate you being part of this, and hopefully lots and lots of people are going to be able to listen to this and see this and benefit and start doing these practices, these transformational practices. Oh, I wrote an article one time, just mentioned it, that the Buddha didn't need no stinking Holosync was the name of it, and basically the answer in the article was, so the Buddha didn't have Holosync, but now we have tools that make healing and waking up and staying awake more available to more of us. And that's just a great, great gift.
Yeah, when I first started, everybody was that was already a meditator, which I was too. I'd been meditating for 16 years before I got into this. Everybody that was a long-time meditator was really skeptical, and well, if you don't have to work as hard, it's you're not getting all the blah blah blah. And I just said, hey, look, I'm interested in results, and I got more results in 1 year of doing this than the previous 16 years of being very disciplined as a traditional meditator. And if you want results and you want them faster, this will give it to you.
It was lovely to hear you. Thanks so much.
Another musician. You'd be surprised how many musicians are attracted to this kind of sonic activity, or maybe they become musicians after they start practicing for a while. I'm not sure. But Bill, Deep Val, thank you so much.